I am. I don't think anybody can be using AWS without grappling with identity and access management. If you're anything like me, oh wait, I was going to start out. I wanted to take a second to thank you, Mary Beth, Josh, Calvin, for organizing this meetup. It wouldn't happen without you, and everybody should know. Yeah. Okay, so now, if you're like me at all, like AWS, you're like, oh, it's cool. I can throw stuff, right? Push my backups up. Like, they're going to run DNS. That's great. They can do that, right? And IAM, sure. Like, I'll make an account so that I can manage this stuff. A year or so later, you're like, oh, I'm going to set up a cluster of machines, right? Have like S3 buckets. Now I'm managing like the access between those things. And then you've got CloudFront in the mix, like databases, all of this stuff going on, and you eventually realize, even more stuff going on. And you're like, IAM is the beating heart of this entire thing. It controls what can do what, when, and how. And so, like, on that journey, I realized it's worth like taking time to appreciate it, how it works, what you can do to understand it. This here is the like standard AWS blurb, right? I'm tempted to read it. I'll go ahead and read a bit. It lets you secure access control, right? Oh, right. No. Here's the bit. You can control. Whoops. Who is authenticated and authorized to use resources, right? It lets you do sharing, granular permissions, right? Like that's got a mechanism behind it, which we will learn about. You can do multi-factor, like all of these beautiful things are provided by this service, and well, the job of IAM is, oh man, this was the clip from Indiana Jones where he throws the Nazi out of the blimp and he's got like no ticket. Like IAM's job is to be the bouncer, right? Somebody comes up, hey, I want to use this API to do this thing. It says, not that thing, not you, or yeah, come on in, buddy. That's its job. So the two things that it's responsible for are authentication and authorization, right? Authentication, right? It's like somebody is presenting some kind of secret information so that you can sort of prove who you are. That, I think, we all pretty much get. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Authorization, like what are you allowed to do now that AWS has some idea of who you are? Like that is the core part in my mind. So we all sort of understand various like versions of permission systems, right? Like standard Unix permissions, right? You've got a user or a group, right? The root group or the root user, the wheel group. They have this set of permissions, right? You can read, write, or execute on some like object in the file system namespace, right? That like. We get that. Also, like network ACLs, that's a permission system. You have the source of a packet, like the protocol and port that it's going to, and like the destination. Like that's all the same. Like there's a subject, there's a verb, and there's an object. It's acting in this way, right? This is like generalizable, right? You can have any kind of set of rules, and you can sort of break it down into there's something that's trying to do something to another thing, and that's by and large the way the AWS API is organized, and that's what we're talking about. So all of that, well, the mapping right from the subject, verbs, and objects here are all based around the IAM policies. There are a few different types of IAM policies, and I'm going to like defer talking about the different types and just sort of dig into what a policy like generically consists of. There's obligatory a version number. There's two versions, right? You think of these like an HTML specification version, right? In your page that you're sending, right, you put an HTML version, and that says like how the browser should interpret the HTML that it gets. That's what this version is. Don't replace that date with the current date. It's going to break. There are statements which are like declaring the rules for the policy, which you can have more than one rule inside of or more than one statement inside of a policy, and those consist of like some of these parts. Effect, right? That's like, is it an allow or a deny? Those are your two options. You're defining a behavior and you're saying this is permitted or this is not permitted. The principal is the subject of this like sentence that we're saying is either allowed or not allowed. So you specify a user, a role, some AWS service, and there's a slide about like going into detail on that. Then there's actions, right? These are the API calls that this rule is about, right? This rule is concerning itself with allowing the root of this account to use IAM list users and IAM list roles so it can get the list of users and roles. And the resource, that is the identifier for the objects that the rule applies to. So like this rule is guarding access to all of the IAM users and roles, right? You could imagine putting like a specific user in that list, and you would find that that's the one that account can then access. Finally, there are conditions which just add extra information, extra filtering for the rule, for the applicability of a rule. And we'll cover that a little bit more in detail. So principles, apologies for this slide. These next slides are also going to be like punch it in the eyeballs. But there's AWS account root users, there's IAM users, there's federated users, there's IAM roles, there's assumed role sessions, AWS services, and anonymous users, right? You can see there different ways to specify those individual things. So depending on what sort of entities you have in your environment, you can address them in a policy and make them able to do or unable to do things. So like just more detail on the action section, right? Here's some example. What we have here is the AWS service name prefixed by the API call. So we can see there's SQS, like has a send message function. This action here, right? EC2 start instances, get instance object, those are square brackets because that's a JSON list, right? You can do a glob, right? This action S3:* means like whatever actions are available from the S3 service, like all of them. You can also put the globs at the beginning. So anything to do with access keys is what this last action is addressing. And then resources. I want to digress a little bit to talk about the ARN, the AWS resource name. You see it everywhere. And it has this particular, there's three variants of its format. So they're all prefixed with ARN, and they have the partition, which is typically just AWS. If you use GovCloud or I imagine the China region, that partition will be a separate, because there's a hard line between GovCloud and public AWS. And then you have an option to specify a region, the account ID, the resource type, and then like an S3 bucket, we can see in the example here, has the path inside of the bucket to the object that you're referring to. An EC2 instance has the option to specify the instance ID. And something that we notice is that IAM policies are also like, all of these things get ARNs. And so when you're specifying a policy, you can have, well, you're giving permissions to the things that allow permissions to exist, which is worth paying attention to as you have, as you're defining roles. Yeah. And then finally, conditions. Conditions are composed of condition operators. You can, in the link on the very last slide, there's a huge list of operations you can perform on the data that the policy has available to it to evaluate whether or not the policy applies or the action is allowed based on the definition of the policy. So then depending on the context of the API call that you're making, different keys are available. So if you are calling the EC2 API, for instance, there would be a resource tag available. I mean, there's a resource tag like namespace available in which you can have arbitrarily defined tag names, and then you can say, does this arbitrarily defined tag name match this string that I'm putting in here? And then that determines whether or not the API call can succeed. So taking off from there, right, there's, so we just discussed the basic like policy structure and the things that fit into a policy. There are flavors of a policy. There are policies that you attach directly to an IAM user or a group or roles. There are policies that apply directly to a resource. So like, sorry, to skip back a little bit. An identity policy that you would attach to a user, for instance, would say, this user can do anything in EC2. They're not allowed to use Lambda. They can, right, sort of set up the boundaries for that. A resource policy you would attach to something like an S3 bucket or an Elastic, or not Elastic, the ECR, what is that? Elastic Container Registry? It is Elastic? Okay. Elastic Container Registry or the AWS backup service to allow whoever walks up to set the permissions of somebody who's approaching that resource, maybe perhaps regardless of like what other credentials they have to provide. So the identity policy in the first line is like a permission slip. They're like, oh, okay, you can do this, take this with you, show it to whoever you run into, right? It's the card that you have on your neck and you beep at the door and see if you can get in the doors. A resource policy is like a sign that's set up at the fairgrounds that's like, you must be this tall to ride. Either you're that tall or you're not. The resource policy gets that say-so. There's a trust policy, which is, I think of this as a special case of the resource policy. The trust policy you attach to an IAM role, and that determines who's allowed to use that role, right? The role itself has its own identity policy attached to it so that you can present like, hey, I've got this role, right? I can get into a door that I otherwise wouldn't be able to get into myself by virtue of having this role. And the trust policy declares who is allowed to assume certain roles. And finally, there are certain scope limiting policies that you define on objects that prevent, like, it takes the subset, right? You've got these policies because of the user you are or the groups you're in or the roles you've assumed, but you have this other limitation that says, you know what? You can't actually do this set of things because it's not in the policy that is defined here. So that's like policies and how policies are attached to various entities. So how do these entities actually do things inside of AWS? There's two flavors, I think. There's the flavors that use long-lived credentials. This is a root user where you can go get an access key. You shouldn't. There's users where you can go get an access key. And and that there's groups which, like, you throw users into, and actually, like, the groups use the access key of the whatever member user you're connecting to AWS with. And then those, like, connect directly to IAM, and then are able to use their credentials directly against the services. IAM, when you're using IAM roles for a service account or a federated user, or just as an IAM user who's assuming a role, what you do is you make an API call that says to the IAM STS service, says, I'd like to assume this role. And then that uses normal IAM to check, are you in the trust policy? Are you allowed to accept this role, or to assume this role? And then if you are, you get a different set of tokens than your normal tokens. As a user, you've got your access key. It gives you a separate set of access keys that are generated and will expire depending on how the policies are defined, like after like 15 minutes or an hour or 12 hours. And there are various conditions under which, like, you can set certain time periods. But then you can use the credentials that you got from the STS service in the same way that you would to make API calls to any of the resources. So just another minute on the scope limiting policies. When you make that request to STS that says, I'd like to assume this role, you can also throw in the request, like, but this role has these permissions that I don't want to use. So restrict me to this other set of permissions. So you throw it the role that you're assuming and some other policy that defines a subset of those permissions, and then the credentials you get back from the STS service only let you do the things that were in both lists. So this is powerful when you are doing complicated, like, enterprise scenarios. But mostly, we don't need to, until you get there, until you find a need for it, like the world says, this is what you need, don't try to use it. There's also permissions boundaries, which are the same notion, except you attach that directly to the IAM policy itself. So anytime somebody assumes this role, it does the subset of this thing. So that's sort of like, you can do it based on, like, people's memberships and all other kinds of things. And then there's a version of this that applies at the account level, where, like, nobody inside of this account, like, regardless of what permissions they think they want to have, they're not allowed to do these certain things. Which, like, comes into when you have an AWS organization with several accounts, you've got, like, dev and prod and all of these things. It makes sense to have some of these to control the capabilities of, like, your user set. So this is the standard AWS flowchart for determining whether or not you can do a certain thing. Based on your permissions or the assumed role permissions that you have, when you make an API call to a certain API, it will check to see, is there a deny policy in that top-level organizational security control or service control policy? And if there isn't a deny in there, then it will go and check. First it checks, do you have a deny in your policies? And if you don't, then it will check the organization policy. And if you don't, it will check the resource policy, which, if that has an allow, it will just let you do it. Otherwise, it checks your permissions boundaries and then the session permissions. And then if there's not a deny in any of those places and not a resource allow, and you otherwise have a permission, it will work, which is great. Here's a non-flowchart version of that. So your identity-based policy is the IAM policy that's attached to an assumed role or your user account or the group that you're in. Or the service role that you've assumed if you're like an AWS service doing a thing on behalf of the user. And so any of the things that are defined in a resource-based policy that are within the permissions boundary, or any of the things that are in your identity policy that are within the permissions boundary or the resource boundary are allowed. Yes, and with that, I'd like to pause for questions. If anybody has any kind of like thing they want to ask, like maybe, let's see, let me check the time, because I feel myself having done a bit of a ramble. I'm 20 minutes so far. Yeah, cool. All right, no one want to interject with some curiosity? Okay, that's cool. So I'll just hop over into the console and show some things that are kind of nice, and then I put together some examples of policies in action. How is that for like screen size? Yeah, I got one thumb. I got, oh, more, okay, plenty of thumbs. All right. So yeah, if I, so what I've got here is an AWS root account. Oh boy. So 1Password has my keys in it, and I just gotta get it. And it will copy my MFA token to my clipboard. This is pretty great. I'm also using the Firefox containers, which means that this tab is a separate session, completely separate session from this tab and this tab, which is pretty nice because I wanted to use 3 different accounts to like demonstrate things. So anyway, in this yellow account, this is the root account, right? This is my cool email address, and I made BossCat and HinchCat, which are the 2 other accounts that are going to be playing here. And what I was going to show you is, oh yeah, I jumped ahead. I was going to show you just the IAM console because you've probably seen it, but in here are the things that I've been talking about. There's groups and there's users and there's roles, there's policies. I sort of skipped over identity providers, but we'll get there if we don't run out of time. Yeah, so over here in users, I've got one user. It's pretty great. We can check out the security credentials, right? I mean, you can set the MFA stuff and rotate the access keys. You can control what groups they're in. I haven't defined any groups in here. There's roles, right? Let's see, there's this EC2 S3 access role. If we check it out, we can see it has this S3 read-only access policy, and the trust relationship that it has, it shows you EC2, Amazon, AWS. If I drill into that, we can see the policy defined here. What we've got is we've got an allow for the service EC2 that does the security, the security token service assume role. So this role is this is a resource policy on this role that allows EC2 to assume it. And then the permissions that it gets when it does that are these. Is S3 list and read. If we hop into JSON mode, we can see that we've got the action get star and list star for all the resources, right? Well, sorry, it's S3 get star and S3 list star. So it can list and get anything in this account that's in S3. Yep. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to back out of this. Another thing, right? Down here is the permissions boundary not set, right? This is where you would set if you wanted to deny access to like everything except this one bucket, you could put that, you could define another policy that says everything but this one bucket deny, and then attach that as the permissions boundary. So that you don't have to modify this like stock AWS managed policy, or for other more complicated like environmental reasons inside your organization. Yes, I wanted to show in the policy definition area here. Let me get a policy that I wrote. And I wanted to hop into the editor because, gosh, the editor is kind of nice. You got this like service dropdown, or you can like I'm going to add the Amplify service. I want all the list, all the read ones, and then right, you can specify resources, you can specify conditions, right? And it's just sort of like MFA required. It's a checkbox. You don't have to like learn the whole condition thing and then say, review the policy. Like, what are the changes that I'm making here? And you can after you've sort of halfway built this out, you can go, I don't know what's happening. Anyway, so what I like to do, like the infrastructure as code stuff that I do, like what I will often do is come in here, build the thing that I think is going to work, and try it until it works, and then yank that JSON out and put it into the repo. Which saves a lot of time than like deploy. I think I fixed it. You get it working, and then that's what you've codified. Yeah, cool. So, yeah, I think those are the main things like in the control panel here. There's identity. Well, no, we'll do that later. I set up a SAML endpoint so that I could show you the SAML endpoint, but I put it on the list as the last thing to do. So we're gonna go check out the cross account. How do I, like, as the manager of this? Right, I have to sign into this other account. So I just signed in as my normal user. Like I'm signed into like the root account using the IAM user that's defined in this users list here. But I want to be in the HinchCat account. So what I did previously is I put the account number for that HinchCat account, which is it's in the organizations list, which I don't have pulled up and I'm not going to bother with. Then I put in the role that has permissions inside of that account, and then I gave it a display name. So that's what I'm using here because my nice browser tab has saved it. So now I'm inside of the HinchCat account. I'm going to hop over to IAM and show you the permissions policy that allows that, or the role that allows that to happen. So by default, when you add an account to an AWS org, it creates an organization account access role that has a trust relationship that points to the account that created it. So this is the account number of that account. It says this account can assume this role. The permissions that are by default on this, it's an inline policy that says you can do anything you want. So in a non-demo situation, you might want to update that so that people coming in from the root account into the whatever sub-account like has the appropriate permissions for like the given scenario. But I'm just using like what came out of the box. So something that's important to notice is also my user in the primary account. It has administrator access, which allows me to do anything to anything. If instead of having administrator here, I had some other permission set that didn't explicitly allow this STS, like trying to assume a role in another account in this specific account, trying to assume this specific role inside this specific account, it would not work. You need in the account where the user exists, a permission to take the role in the other account, and in the other account, you need a permission to let that account be used, or that role be used. Yeah, that's cool. Oh, no, my pen. It's going to mark it off. Check. All right. So that's cool. So that's using the identity policies in 2 different accounts to collaborate and like make a thing happen. Another thing that I've set up is, oh, yeah. In UBossCat, you got to get logged in. So the same deal for logging in over here. Oh, man, so nice, MFA. So this BossCat account has an S3 bucket called HingeCat Share. The BossCat needs to share some important documents with the HingeCat, right? Otherwise, not going to know what's going on. So what he has done is set. What am I doing? Oh, drill into this thing. And then the permissions, he set a resource policy, a bucket policy on this resource. Is that, I'm going to do a zoom. Right, so he has given anybody in the HingeCat account permissions to the HingeCat share bucket and the things inside of it, right? But he set the condition they have to be in US East 1. The request has to be coming from US East 1, otherwise no deal, no deal. So over in the HingeCat account, if I hop over to S3, what I'm going to do is see nothing, which like, oh no. But you wouldn't think that the S3 list that list buckets, right, gets called when you hit this. Like, it's not going to query every account in the universe, right? It's going to just query the buckets that would be in your account. But if I edit the URL over here and say buckets, HingeCat, HingeCat share, it's like, yeah, there's some file in here. And if I go and I do an upload, hopefully I can find a good file quick. Yeah, that's a good one. Just jam it up there. We can see, right? It's got the cached. Where's the refresh button? Oh, there it was, yeah. All right, so now the BossCat has the HingeCat's like daily crime report, which is great. And that's because of that bucket that bucket policy that I'm sure you all remember, and I don't need to show again, which is cool. Check. Something that I'm aware of as like the administrator of these like sub-accounts for these cats is that the BossCat occasionally wants to destroy this safe file, but he shouldn't be able to do that. The HingeCat puts that file there, and it's important that it stays there. The BossCat has like no business deleting this file. So I made a service control policy here that says save the safe file from the BossCat. And it applies to, right, where does it say? I've got it attached to one entity, the BossCat account. He's not allowed to do the delete object on that file. So that's an example of that organizational service control policy preventing an action that is undesirable to the larger enterprise. Cool. The HingeCat has some other stuff going on, which is cool. Let's hop over. Oh, you know what? I got the 5-minute sign a minute ago. I'll go back over here. So cross-account access, right? This is a user taking their long-term security token, talking to IAM, coming over to the other account, assuming the trust policy, getting a temporary token, and then being able to like do business, right? This is the token being delivered, but then like I'm in this other account, just like a user of this account, using the temporary tokens that I got from the service, right? Right. So the cross-account S3 resource policy, right? This resource policy on this bucket allows the entities inside the HingeCat account to just like put stuff in the bucket, right? That's cool and easy. The service control policy is defined over here in the root account, and it's being applied to the organization in the sub-account, and that's preventing the boss cat from deleting that file that he shouldn't be deleting. The next thing, this is cool. I decided I should show you this chart before I dove in. So there's a thing for Aurora, the database service. IAM, it's like IAM credentials. So it's essentially a plugin for MySQL or Postgres that will have MySQL or Postgres, when it tries to authenticate a user, call over to IAM and say, hey, I got these permissions. I got this password. Is it the correct password? Instead of relying on its own password store, it asks IAM, hey, is this right? So what you do is you create a policy that says EC2 is allowed to use, or you create a role that says EC2 is allowed to use this role. Inside that role, you specify this is a user account that you can get credentials for. And then the EC2 instance uses its temporary credentials to request from the STS service, hey, can I have a password for this database user? And then it uses that database user password to connect to the RDS instance, which is cool. Because then you don't have to rotate the password because it's just defined in policies, right? Like the permissions inside of that database are all just like the normal data. You do a grant to the user, but you also give that user the IAM access role, or whatever it's called. And it works. Yeah. So, yeah, it's cool. Let me show you the policy, because that's the best part. Let's see. Filter, custom, managed, EC2, IAM, RDS. Right, policy usage, right? Wait. Oh, I'm on the policy. I didn't mean to be on the policy. I meant to be on the role, which is like, that's the one struggle that I always have. The trust relationship, it trusts EC2, right? EC2 can do the STS thing to get this. If I drill into this policy, we can see that the action RDS DB connect is allowed to the resource, which like all of this points to the database instance. And then there's a database user called pgcat that has the IAM authentication role inside of the database attached to it, right? As like the database permission system. Yeah, cool. Check. And so then the other thing is SAML. HingeCat anticipates like having a very large organization, so they're using an external directory to manage like reporting, structure, and all of that, distribution groups, right, what have you, and so. And he doesn't want to have to go in and make individual users for all of those people and then have to manage those and like life cycle them. They're doing all the life cycling in the external directory, but he wants them to be able to use the account. So we set up an identity provider. We're doing SAML. If I drill into this thing, we can see, well, not very much, that the SAML provider has like, I don't know, it's got some metadata you can infer from like download, upload the metadata, which just has to do with like the way SAML works. Basically, the upshot is this. You have a bunch of users that are all defined inside the identity provider. You don't have like any care or concern what happens like with authentication over there. What you do care about is it's using this this trusted channel to like the identity provider gave you a cert, and it said, well, you gave IAM the cert that the identity provider gave you. They're saying, I'm signing these credentials. This person is in these groups. Give them whatever access you need. So then the STS assumes the role, right, and then gives the credential to the user based on what the identity provider tells IAM, right? IAM assumes the correct role and passes the credentials over, and then you're able to do all of the stuff. Yeah. Right, yeah. So I'm done. Here's a bunch of like sources. Yeah. Question?
We got questions for Caleb. I'll have you use the microphone so it goes on recording.
Caleb, I had a question
Yes.
on the generating the JSON for the permissions. Is there an editing tool and like a verification tool that helps you do that within AWS?
The best editor like going, in my opinion, is like if you hop into the policy thing and you create a policy here, you choose the service that you want to have the thing, right? Like, oh, we're gonna make some EKS permissions. We're gonna let people do tagging on EKS. We're gonna choose like specific, right? We're gonna choose like the cluster or the Fargate profile that we want them to do that with. Like, this tool is great because it has insight into your AWS resources, so it can auto-populate those things. It also like doesn't get stale when AWS adds new functionality, adds new API calls that are available and that kind of thing. I would do like all of that like prototypey kind of work like directly here.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
This might be just a general question about the group since I'm new.
Okay.
Do they typically make the slide decks available after the presentation?
Yeah, we'll put the slides up. Mary Beth will send out a link to the video because the video will be up on YouTube as well, and there'll be slides up available.
Do we still use, there was a GitHub repo that had, so yeah, there's an IndyAWS
Yeah.
GitHub repo that has like all of the slides from since we've bothered to start putting them in there.
I think ever. If we're allowed to have them, we put them up.
Oh yeah.
Any other questions for Caleb? Awesome. Let's give Caleb a big round of applause. Thank you for putting that together for us.